Good day. I'm John Fernandes. Welcome to this edition of eNEWSLINE Live. As many of us begin to realize, the future is less predictable than ever before. And with access to information at everyone's fingertips, a time of crisis can mean disaster to many organizations. In today's episode, Dean Erika James of the Goizueta Business School at Emory University and I will cover a topic that has become crucial, not only in the world of business, but increasingly in higher education: crisis management. Dean James, who has long specialized on crisis management, will share valuable insights on how organizations can manage crisis, and perhaps more importantly, convert it to opportunity. Dean James is a published researcher and expert in workplace diversity and crisis leadership, whose corporate clients have included Fortune 500 companies such as American Express, Johnson & Johnson, and Pepsi Bottling Company. Prior to her deanship at Goizueta, Dean James served as Senior Associate Dean for Executive Education at the Darden Graduate School of Business, where she also introduced the Women's Leadership Program. We are all excited to have the great pleasure of welcoming Dean James to the ENL studios today. Erika, welcome to ENL.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
We're so happy to have you. Well, we get right into the questions, and initially we'll start with some prepared questions and then take some audience questions. Before we begin discussing about strategies for managing crises, could you share a bit of your background that led you to becoming an expert on crisis management?
I'd be happy to. It was an interesting entree into the world of crisis management. I started early in my academic career focusing on matters of diversity in the workplace, primarily because I wanted to understand my mother's experience of having to navigate through multiple organizations and the ways in which diversity played out, or her career success played out differently depending on relative to her counterparts, if you will. So my first academic appointment was Tulane University. I was teaching a group of working professionals in the MBA format, and many of them were working for an oil company. And it was an oil company that was going through a major class action discrimination lawsuit. And over the course of the semester, my class was hijacked because what these students wanted to talk about was their experience in their organization as their company was going through this discrimination allegation. And what I realized over a period of time is that for the organization itself, this had really become a crisis for them. So in their efforts to manage diversity, however successfully or unsuccessfully they were doing that, it really ended up becoming a need to manage a crisis situation. And so that then led to a foray into me looking at all other forms of crises as well.
Very interesting, though, in the comment of diversity. I started with then Exxon Company USA in 1975, a long time ago. That's 40 years. And diversity wasn't even a word that was used in the corporate culture. So I can imagine, and I know that Exxon particularly went through a number of spills, Valdez being the big one that I can recall during the time I was there. And I do think that crises have an impact on broadening thinking even beyond the crisis itself. It is an opportunity. I'm not sure a CEO of a for-profit company thinks that, but it can be an opportunity for success.
I agree, it certainly can be. And over the years, as I have gained more experience and knowledge and understanding about the world of crises and crisis management, what I've understood is that there's been considerable focus on the management of a crisis, so the response, what does one do to deal or address the problem at hand? And I think where leaders have lacked is thinking about that next step, and how do I take this situation, which was a threat to the organization, a threat to our reputation, how do I learn from that in a particular way that helps set the stage for the organization to be different, better, stronger, more competitive than it was even before the situation. So the focus that I have is really on what are the leadership responsibilities to take the organization to the next level post-crisis.
Great. Well, good start. Although most of our audience is generally aware of what crisis management is, how would you define a crisis, and what it could mean to an organization?
I have a very simple definition of crisis. Quite frankly, it's any situation that threatens the financial well-being, the reputation, or the operations of an organization. And anything that does that could potentially become a significant crisis. I also have two subgroups of crises, and this was something that I learned from a dear friend and colleague, Larry Smith, from the Institute for Crisis Management, who recognized that there are sudden crises and then there are smoldering crises. Quite frankly, sudden crises are the things that happen out of the blue. We don't really anticipate or expect them, and oftentimes, although not always, the organization doesn't have considerable responsibility or fault in the crisis. Natural disasters, terrorist attacks would be examples of sudden crises. Smoldering crises are those things that happen internally to an organization. They're small problems that oftentimes are unrecognized as troubling events or go intentionally ignored, that over a period of time then fester or smolder until they erupt into a significant crisis. The news tends to make a great deal out of the sudden crises. Those are the splashy events that get all of our attention. But the vast majority of the managers and leaders that we train in business schools will spend the vast majority of their time addressing smoldering issues. And so I try to bring the smoldering dilemmas to the forefront when I talk about crisis and crisis management and crisis leadership.
Well, later on in the discussion, we will have a specific question on whether or not there is or an impending crisis in higher education, and that might be an opportunity to discuss a smoldering crisis. Your research has included study of the crisis management strategies implemented by BP after the Deepwater Horizon oil rig accident of 2010. What are your thoughts on how BP handled itself and managed the crisis after this accident?
Mm-hmm. I have a number of thoughts. I had the good fortune of being there at the Incident Command Center for the Deepwater Horizon, not during the explosion, but in the weeks following, once their crisis management approach had been put into place. I will say that, as you very well know, there was a lot of negative media attention on BP for their communication in response to the crisis, and much of that was deservedly so. I mean, they essentially early on failed in their crisis communication efforts. Having been there in the line of fire, if you will, at the Incident Command Center, I had a different perspective than most the common person had, and I did recognize that there were a number of tactics and strategies that BP put in place to actually engage in meaningful crisis management. Their Incident Command Center was just a amalgamation of stakeholders who all had important contributions and added value to the response efforts. They were working hand in hand, they were thinking proactively, they were being responsive the way that they needed to be, but where they really failed was in the communication aspect of their response. And so, because that's the visible piece, I think it really harmed their reputation for a very long time.
Well, I tend to look at this through a somewhat protected environment, working for a not-for-profit. My belief is that you look the crisis straight on and you do what's right. And that's easy for me to say in a not-for-profit environment. And I imagine scenarios of crises affecting AACSB or management education in general. But I think it's often harder for a CEO in a for-profit environment with all the financial stakeholders that simply want you to get them out of it and minimize the damage. And it times can cause individuals to be reluctant to step out front and really take control of the situation like it needs. It needs singular leadership. One of the ones I recall that was, we're not picking on Louisiana today, but post-Katrina,
yes,
they seem to be devoid of central leadership. And the person that stood out and offered the most balanced, thoughtful, deep approach to accepting the crisis and moving forward was a business school dean, then president of Tulane University, Scott Cowan.
Yes.
If you recall back at CNN. So I do think that in a for-profit environment, your stakeholders do have some impact on your thinking. In a not-for-profit environment, it's simply stare at it and do the right thing, because the environment will forgive you more quickly for costing financially but ruining reputation. And in the corporate sector, you've got both to worry about, so it's tough.
Yeah. Having started my career at Tulane, I was very familiar with the school and the university, and I paid a lot of attention to how President Cowan was managing his response. And he really did engage in a set of leadership behaviors that I think salvaged the university. There were so many companies and organizations that just saw their demise as a result of Katrina. Yeah. And what he did was think very differently about what this university was intended to do, who it could be, and how it could be a player in resolving the needs of the broader New Orleans and Louisiana community, and completely became a different school in response to that. So I give him a great deal of credit for having a vision to use that very negative experience in a way to really propel both the university and the city.
Okay. Well, he didn't pay us to say that, but it is a plug for business school deans. Darn presidents. Could you share an example of an actual event in which a company under fire effectively managed a crisis, and one where the opposite was true? What are the must-dos of effective crisis management?
So one that comes to mind pretty readily for me is recently in the news. A couple years ago, GM CEO Mary Barra started her tenure as the CEO of General Motors, and very soon thereafter was faced with the recall of all the General Motors vehicles, and was put under the fire very quickly and needed to be responsive to something that had implications for their company and for the world, quite frankly. My belief is that she handled that very well, particularly as a new CEO, particularly as a female CEO who had a lot of scrutiny on her, primarily because she was the first CEO of a major automotive company. So there was the visibility, the attention that she was receiving, and then also needing to manage a significant crisis was a lot of pressure. And yet what she did was has a great deal of authenticity in her communication style. She acknowledged the areas that GM was not living up to its values and missions and not serving its customer base. She acknowledged that there were problems. She indicated that she was going to address those problems and fix them, and she did all of those things, and she was constantly communicating with the various stakeholders that needed her attention. So I think that would be an example of a well-managed crisis. I think staying in the automotive industry, a couple years prior to that, Toyota had its own set of recalls, and they, I think, managed the situation a little less effectively. There was a great deal of time in which there were denials that were happening, and there was this defensive posture that had taken place. I suspect part of that may have been culturally. It was Japanese. It was a Japanese organization, and they have a different approach, and yet it was a crisis that was affecting stakeholders in the U.S. And so I think that made it very difficult, and Toyota spent some time working their way out of that dilemma. Yeah,
that's a great example. I think what we didn't talk about earlier, but there's two variables there that bring me to attention. One is, do you think that women leaders handle crises better than men? I'm going to ask you that. And then the second thing is how much culture affects you in managing a crisis in different environments. I don't think you can be unicultural, but I think you can be sensitive locally and respond accordingly. So
yes. Yeah.
Well, you also have experience in working with organizations in areas such as change process and trust building. For a business school or organization undergoing significant change, such as AACSB, as it welcomes a new CEO that just started the 1st of March, Tom Robinson, what strategy should be in place for a seamless transition and securing trust of staff and stakeholders?
Well, as a new leader myself, I'm very attuned to this issue of transitions and seamless transitions. I feel very fortunate that my transition into Goizueta was managed very well, and as transitions go, it was a smooth one. What I take away from that, and thinking about my own research into this area and consulting and change management, preparation is key. And so the more that you are able to, either as a new leader coming in, learn about the organization, learn the people, learn the history, listen, those kinds of things will serve the new leader very well. And I think it's also incumbent on the organization to provide as much information as possible. Now, that said, you've hired this new person precisely because they have, or he or she has a set of ideas and perspectives and experiences that you want to bring into the organization so that it moves into a new or a different direction. And I think finding the balance, striking the balance between appreciating and honoring what is excellent about the organization in its current state, and where there are opportunities to try some things new and differently that the new leader can bring on board, will be important. So finding that balance is key.
I think that's absolutely straight on, and I see so much more opportunity for ACSB with new leadership than my continuing another 5 years. And I think that Tom will be a great leader for ACSB. Now, the points that you make about listening and finding the seams, what is the best approach at this time? I think that's very appropriate. What I would ask about is what level of speed, or is speed impacted by the situation? Specifically, when I came to ACSB in 2000, it was very clear from the board that they wanted change and they wanted it now. In fact, the terminology used to me, I wouldn't repeat, was very direct, and let's just say it was fix it. So my ability to listen too much to too many people, and I did talk to all the staff, it was helpful, was constrained. So how would you say the immediacy that stakeholders require of action versus the natural tendency to want to learn plays into the decision on how to approach your new responsibilities?
Again, it's a matter of striking the balance. I came into Goizueta, and there were some stakeholders who were very clear in articulating a need for action and move forward and be aggressive. And there were others who want and deserved to be listened to and respected and honored for what they, over the years, have brought to the organization. The way that I am thinking about it now is, where are there areas where we can all agree that there's a need to do some things now, and let's move forward in getting those done. And where there are areas that still require some attention, require some discussion, require some buy-in and some convergence, then let's give ourselves the proper time to get that right and get people at a point where they feel comfortable in the direction that you're moving. But I don't think we need to wait to start to implement a strategic plan, if you will, for everything to be lined up. I think there are areas where you can start to move right away.
Very good. How has your knowledge in crisis management been valuable in your role as dean?
Fortunately, I have not needed to. I've not needed to manage a crisis quite yet, and hopefully that won't be the case. But I will say that having that background, which is really just another take on looking at leadership and thinking about decision making and thinking about what's necessary to lead an organization, to motivate an organization, to solve problems that haven't escalated to a crisis level. Having a background in crisis leadership helps me prepare and manage relationships in a way that I think, should something emerge, we're well positioned to be able to respond, and to also think about how do we leverage that incident into something that can really drive us forward going forward. So that's where the opportunity comes into place. I'm always thinking about what are the next opportunities.
Well, that's good. I think that keeps the school and the university innovative and thriving. So that's an important attribute. How do crisis and change management find their way into the curriculum and various initiatives at Goizueta Business School? Have you seen any other effective practices at other schools as well?
So I've been teaching in the business school environment for almost 20 years, and I have seen an evolution, if you will, of the amount of attention that schools are putting on crisis management, crisis leadership, crisis communications. 20 years ago, there was no conversation about this, and if it was essentially, a 1-hour discussion about crisis communications. More and more, and I was pleased when I joined Darden that I created a crisis leadership elective that was a part of the second-year curriculum. More and more schools now, I think, are moving in that direction. If not a full elective, certainly there's significant class time devoted to understanding matters associated with decision-making under pressure, stakeholder management, crisis communications, etc. I do think that there are a couple of schools who have invested quite a bit of resources and attention to that. At Goizueta, for example, we have day-long seminars for our working professional programs where we bring in experts from the military, and I've even had the opportunity to play a cameo and work with our students to share my knowledge around crisis management. And in other schools, I know the University of Michigan has, for a number of years, been doing crisis challenges for their MBA students. So I think, rightly so, business schools are finding ways to put the crisis curriculum more into the curriculum for their students.
Now, crises can happen in any industry, but one that I think is more prevalent than many right now, maybe besides governments, is cybersecurity.
Yes.
Because of all the attacks. We recently were at the command center at the University of South Florida, and it was incredible to watch, like Star Wars, all these attacks coming to different spots. That day, St. Louis was getting hit very hard. There have been so many compromises of financial information and personal information with insurance companies. Do you think that there's maybe a proactive strategy that one could follow related to those instances which would fall under cybersecurity violations?
Yes, I think, I'm very sensitive to this, having been a victim, if you will, of one of the security breaches from a major company, and then the implications that has on your own financial standing and whatnot. I think for the benefit of their long-term viability and for their consumer protection, companies have to become much more proactive, and I think they are. I think this is top of mind for every executive, but becoming much more proactive in identifying strategies to protect their consumer base, to protect their data. I think part of what business schools and other academic institutions need to do is make sure that we are preparing students to understand both the technology associated with protecting data, and also leading organizations in a way to recognize that data protection, cybersecurity is paramount for any organization to thrive going forward. So we have no choice in this. We have to just become more proactive and aggressive in implementing strategies for securing our data.
Great. As far as preparedness too, it seems to me that one of the areas that has significant growth potential, besides executive education, but in degree programs, is the MS programs and cybersecurity, because it just seems like that's going to be an unpredictably long war to keep those that shouldn't be out of your data. So I think that's something to think about, what you're how much knowledge you're presenting to students about cybersecurity, and whether it's an area of strength in your faculty that you could make a good program.
Right.
So say that to everyone. I understand that corporate engagement comprises a significant part of Goizueta's strategy. Could you describe the corporate engagement strategy that Goizueta pursues and explain why this is an important area of focus for the school?
I'll start with your latter question. It's important for Goizueta largely because of our context. So we're very fortunate to sit in a city that has the third highest concentration of Fortune 500 companies in the country. Not only that, there are a number of companies there who have a significant presence, even if their headquarters is not there. So I believe that business schools have a responsibility to partner and to serve the business community, and we're well positioned to create relationships that allow us to learn what are the needs of the organizations that are in our own backyard, and how do we as a business school help ensure that we are preparing and deploying talent to those companies, and that those companies have access to the thought leadership that's relevant for the work that they need done in their organization. So leveraging the research from our faculty. But it's important that this is seen as a mutual engagement, that there's something that business schools get from partnering with organizations. For example, we've been very fortunate to have very strong recruiting relationships, and that's something that's pivotal to every business school. You want companies to hire your students, and so the stronger your recruiting relationship, that's a kind of corporate engagement partnership. Beyond that, working with executives, bringing them closer into the classroom, exposing our students to the real world issues that companies are facing, that leaders are facing, both helps in making sure that we are designing the right curriculum and giving our students exposure to key decision-making opportunities, consulting engagements, leveraging and using their knowledge that they're gaining in the classroom in ways that might help solve an organization's challenge that companies themselves, isn't in a position to put resources behind. So those kinds of partnerships are mutually beneficial. Our students gain, and the company gains from the advice and the insight and perspective that our students are able to provide them. So what we're trying to do is really find more opportunities for where we can provide mutual benefit for each other.
Yeah. Well, Emory University, particularly in the southern part of the United States, seems to have tremendous potential in the area of providing relevant corporate executive education and impact on their degree programs too. It's because of the structure of the university and the integration of business. It just seems to me to be a great opportunity. But I wonder, what about the school that is strictly business and doesn't have a broad base touch to other universities? How would you suggest that they become innovative in matching corporate needs with their skill set, or in maybe enhancing them through cooperative relationships? What would be your suggestion?
I think it's incumbent upon every school to identify what its niche is. If there's not something that in which they can identify they're really adding value, then I would question why they're in existence, quite frankly. So I do believe that every existing business school is able to provide value in some form or fashion, and the challenge of the leaders and the faculty is to identify what that is. And then it might not, for example, be the corporate community that one wants to engage with. I'm thinking, for example, of Babson, who has really gone full-fledged in identifying itself as a school focused on entrepreneurship. And so that's a different kind of community that they would seek and try to partner and create mutually rewarding relationships with. A school like Atlanta that sits in a major metropolitan area, it would make sense to identify with the corporate community that's there. A school that's in DC, for example, and centered in a political and governmental context might position itself to serve that community. So I think the challenge is recognizing what the context is, what the school strengths and positive attributes are, and finding a way to connect both the context and their strengths to serve the community.
You gave me the opportunity, Erika. I never miss an opportunity to plug Babson because it was where I received my undergraduate degree, but I recall a long, long time ago, if you can imagine, I started in '75. This was a long time ago. Babson thought about entrepreneurship really early, and Honestly, I thought in 1971 it invented the term. I had never heard of it at 18 years old. But the way it even informally and now formally threaded it through the curriculum and kept touch with business, I thought was very different for the time. As first semester freshmen, we had to work on a consulting basis in teams with local businesses to help them solve a particular problem. Probably what got me started with an interest in internal auditing was problem solving. But I think that's an example of finding an area of maybe difference in priority and then staffing accordingly to make sure you become a leader. Doesn't hurt to keep a high rating. It gives a business school an opportunity that doesn't have an integrated university with all the power that brings to still be successful. So I think they've done a good job and continue to do so.
I agree.
Thanks. Well, workplace diversity and gender issues, particularly within leadership, have been areas of interest for you, for me too. These topics have been widely discussed across higher education and business schools for many years. Do you think that there has been progress in enhancing diversity with management education? Where should there be higher priority in order to make a greater impact in this area?
There has been progress, and I think it's also incumbent upon us to really think about how we're defining diversity. So if one were to define diversity in the traditional sense of race and gender, and do we have a broad representation of folks from different racial backgrounds and a combination of men and women, there has been some progress, and I think we still have tremendous opportunity to, as business schools, to do better in that regard. If we think and expand the notion of diversity and think about the kinds of students, the kinds of faculty that we're bringing into our environments, the classroom now feels very different than it did for me 20 years ago as a new professor starting out. Before, it was very, very common, for example, to have engineers and economics majors sitting in your classrooms. Now we have people who are coming from the nonprofit community, we have folks who are part of Teach for America, we have folks from the corporate environment, we do still have engineers. We have a much more global student body than we have had in the past. So from all of those measures, then one could easily say, yes, there's been tremendous advancement in the diversity in the classroom population. I think we still have a ways to go, particularly as a global environment, needing to ensure that we're preparing our students to have cultural sensitivity, to have cultural awareness and capability. And quite frankly, we still have a ways to go with the traditional format of diversity in terms of race and gender, particularly at the faculty levels. And as you are well aware, the attention that business schools have been under with the numbers or percentages of women at the MBA levels, we fall behind every other graduate program when it comes to attracting women into the business school context. So there's some work that we can do there.
I agree. I'll be even more direct, because I'm a short timer. In U.S. business schools, there has not been sufficient progress made in diversifying faculty. At the same time, the student bodies are diversifying much more quickly and would diversify even more. And I'm talking about racial makeup. That more has to be done. There needs to be more, if it can't be from the standpoint of a legalistic viewpoint, but from a standpoint of market survival. There must be more affirmative action in hiring faculty. There are many schools now, when we look at the context of the faculty and students, they're very divergent, especially as trends are going. On the international basis, I agree with you 100%, but I feel that's more driven by the full payers and the student supply in general, and I would say also in some regards performance on standardized tests potential. But I don't think progress has been made at faculty as it needs to be, and we need to make a concerted effort to change that. Some of you may know that Erika is the first African-American female dean of a top business school. It is 2015. I've been working for 40 years. I think we would say that that's a long time coming. Glad you're here, and I hope that there are many more individuals that begin to work on diversifying the faculties. So I think we've covered this one in part, but the contrast on this question is, how is higher education faring in comparison to corporate? And I don't think that requires a long answer, but it, I don't know, are we behind, ahead?
In the diversity space?
In the diversity space.
I think that we probably lag relative to the corporate community. And I think we don't have to lag, but I don't think that we as business schools can be isolated, or can isolate ourselves in trying to solve this problem alone. So a few minutes ago we were talking about corporate partnerships and corporate engagement. I see this as a real opportunity to partner with corporate America to find solutions together to diversify the faculty in particular, but also the student bodies. Again, going back to women, even at the senior, we've had for a number of years a pipeline of women, so there's parity in women entering the workforce, right? The higher you go, the fewer women that you see in the executive ranks, the fewer women that you see on boards. That's something that is continuing to get quite a bit of attention, deservedly so. There's a pipeline that needs to be built there. Business schools are a part of that pipeline, and unless K-12 education, unless business schools, unless corporations work in tandem to try to put resources and problem solving around this issue, we will never see the progress that needs to be made in that regard.
Well, that could be economically disastrous, so I hope that I hope people are listening and feeling, I know many feel the same way. A recent Poets and Quants article covered a reading of 10 female deans of leading U.S. business schools at the invitation of Judy Olian, a former chair of our board, and dean of the UCLA Anderson School of Management. You were a part of that meeting that addressed gender inequality within business schools at all levels, students, faculty, and deans. What importance did that meeting have, and what conclusions were drawn?
I think it was very important for me personally to build my network and set of relationships with peer deans was important. But with respect to the issue that brought us together, I think it's important that our community sees that this is a concerted effort, that we are a powerful and influential force, and that when we put our resources and our thinking behind an initiative, we will make significant progress. And so the conclusion is this is important to all of us. All of our schools are facing some version of struggle around women in business, and it might differ for UCLA versus Goizueta versus Northwestern, but at the same time, the overarching challenge is something that we're all grappling with. And so we have committed to working as a unified force to the extent that we can in solving this problem and devoting resources to it.
Well, it's a strong voice. For the past, I would say, more than 10 years, we've had a group within AACSB. It's the Women Administrators in Management Education. And it has really been a wonderful mentoring advice for young women coming into the industry in an administrative leadership role, not all deans. And I believe that it has produced a lot of deans, maybe not directly, but that support system. I say the same thing broadly from a race standpoint and ethnicity with the PhD project. Mm-hmm. It's done a very good job. So I think these initiatives are very helpful. When people are cracking new ground, and I can speak from experience with this, it is much more helpful to have strong like mentors than it is to go it alone. So many had to go it alone, and I appreciate those that have been successful. But going forward, these mentoring environments, these counseling, you can do it, are really important to keeping your confidence in an increasingly tough world.
Mm-hmm. So. Yes.
Well, before we turn to our audience's questions, I'd like to conclude with one more question on crisis management, and I mentioned this earlier. Antagonists might argue that higher education, at least in the United States, is currently in a state of crisis. With escalating tuition costs, outdated models, the diversity question, questionable return on investment as examples, is higher education, particularly in the United States, in fact, facing a crisis? And I think so in many parts of the world that are in mature economies. And are there opportunities that can arise? If so, what steps should business school leaders be taking today?
So this is where I think it's important to go back to the differentiation between types of crises. So sudden crisis and smoldering. The industry of higher education is not going to disappear tomorrow. So there's not a sudden crisis, if you will. Although I do believe that there are a number of smoldering issues, you've identified the key ones, that have been festering for a period of time, and we have absolutely reached the point where we need to be very aggressive in problem solving and decision making and action taking to address some of those issues. And in the absence of doing that, then I do think that we will see a radical change in how education is delivered in this country. So what can we do in the interim is putting heads together to really be creative in thinking about, for example, tuition challenges, and thinking creatively about how we deliver education. And that's not to suggest that online digital content is going to take over. I do think there's a place for that, but I also think that every school offers something different, and that residential education continues to be absolutely critical. And how do we use technology as an enabler to offset some of the costs associated with education, and also advance how we educate our students. But so we're not in sudden crisis mode, but we are definitely smoldering and have to get some of these issues under control.
Yeah, I must speak for the industry. You'd say that the cost crisis is not completely the fault of the industry or of an AACSB. The cost model was in part impacted severely by the reduction of subsidies, particularly to public institutions. But I do think that as society begins to determine how much it's going to spend its limited pie in a global context, that higher education is a first must do, because it leads to a complete change in quality of life for those that are successful. Complete. I speak to that from experience. But I think we have to change our model, and we have to use our academically qualified faculty more wisely, more broadly, and at the same time have a more diverse faculty. So it's going to take all of us working together on these challenges. But with that, I believe that we'll be a strong industry forever as time goes. So now let's turn to our audience and see what they're interested in. There is a long-standing debate as to whether or not leadership can be taught in a classroom. Still more broad. Are there hindrances in teaching crisis or change management in a classroom setting? That makes me think of what would you do? What kinds of pedagogical methods would work best in teaching such content on crisis leadership?
Well, so to the first part of the question, I absolutely believe that aspects of leadership can be taught. But to the questioner's other point, yes, there are clearly better ways of teaching leadership and teaching crisis management and crisis leadership than others. One can read a textbook, if you will, and sort of see what other people have done, or hear the 5 principles of things you must do in response to crisis. I don't find that to be particularly effective. So what we at Goizueta have a long history of doing is really making experiential-based practices a part of our curriculum. And I think when it comes to learning those areas that require decision-making and analysis and making recommendations, like is the case in crisis management and crisis leadership, you've got to create a practical experience for the students. So using simulations, using gamifying our curriculum, those kinds of aspects that I think really help create a more realistic picture of what it will be like when you're actually in the organization addressing a crisis situation.
Well, those seem like very controllable strategies that most schools can do in some form, so I think that's good advice. How do crisis management and leadership relate? How important is it for leaders to be well-versed in crisis management?
It's very important because the data that I have shows that at some point in anyone's career they will face some aspect of crisis, whether it's sudden and certainly the smoldering forms of crisis. So I would say that the difference between crisis management and crisis leadership, as I have come to define it, is that management is the response to a threat once it's happened. It's the reactive approach. It's absolutely mandatory that we're able to respond, but I think it's an insufficient response. And so the leadership is what happens before and post-crisis. So to the extent that you have a leader that is able to anticipate, look across the horizon, see where there are vulnerabilities, put plans in place to mitigate a crisis from happening, that's part of the leadership that you wouldn't necessarily in traditional forms of crisis management. Post-crisis, I think there's also a responsibility for the leader to take a step back, be reflective, understand what his or her or the organization's responsibility was in creating that crisis, and then fundamentally, potentially making changes to how they operate to mitigate a similar kind of crisis going forward. So there's an anticipation phase and there's a learning phase that we don't typically address when we think just about crisis management.
Well, if you're lucky, I've been lucky the past 15 years, but there are predictable crises, and you can envision these and present scenarios. And I'll give you one with ACSB when after 55 years it decides to relocate from St. Louis to Tampa. Forget why Tampa or why not St. Louis. The issue is relocation and 80+% of the staff leaving and all the pressure on the volunteer structure and members at large. But one of the things we did was we knew it was a potential crisis, a crisis of trust, a crisis of credibility. And we identified 25 areas of exposure. Strong people that were making the relocation were responsible for managing those areas in advance of really being taken advantage of. And then also communicating on a matrix basis about risks they saw in another person's area of responsibility. It works seamlessly, and I think that you can sometimes envision the crisis that you're likely to encounter. You can't envision them all, but it helps to minimize those to just a few.
Well, and if I could just add that the practice of thinking about what possible crises or where your vulnerabilities are, even if that particular one doesn't hit, there will be something, and having had the practice of thinking through and putting some plans in place will help you, even if it's a crisis that you hadn't planned for.
So imagine a crisis and what you would do. Do you see value in having a dedicated position whose sole responsibility consists of heading crisis management within an institution?
Ultimately, I think it depends on the nature of the institution. If not, for every organization, I would say, if there's not a single person who's responsible, what might be even more important is to have a team of people who are thinking about putting plans in place, working, teaching, training others about the potential for crisis, what one would do, how to adopt the learning practices post-crisis, et cetera. So I think it can be a risky practice to have all of the crisis management responsibility fall on a single individual, who, by the way, I don't think necessarily should be the CEO or the head of the organization. But it is, I think, important to have a team of people who are prepared and responsible for leading the organization through the operational challenges, through the financial challenges, through the reputational challenges, et cetera, through the communication challenges.
Well, business is so large and complicated. In our organization, I'm the crisis manager, but I really think that in most organizations, it's difficult for the CEO to divorce him or herself from the crisis, as evidenced by your comments relating to how Mary Barra handled her crisis. There was so much credibility in the industry as a whole, not just with GM, with recalls. I think the fact that they got through that, probably misery loves company, and that was helpful, but I think it was managed well, as you pointed out. So, next question, are the rules for navigating through times of crisis in academia and industry different? Are there certain crisis management strategies that may be unique to the academic context?
Very few. I think by and large, there are things that are unique to a particular organization, not necessarily to an industry. The principles of crisis management, needing to respond, needing to communicate, needing to make good, ethical, fast decisions, that is applicable across all industries. So I think there are many more similarities across the academy and corporate America, as there are more similarities than there are differences.
Well, I believe that was our last audience question. So, Erika, thank you for an engaging discussion.
Thank you so much,
Wonderful. John. It was a lot of fun. I've wanting to do crisis management for a while, but we had to wait for you to become dean and then to be comfortable in your seat. So that you're doing very well. So I thank you, and I want to thank our viewers around the world for joining in this episode of eNEWSLINE Live with Dean Erika James. Now, starting in May, AACSB's new president and CEO, Tom Robinson, will be taking the helm of ENL and interviewing thought leaders from around the world. And please do provide him your suggestions. As for me, I want to thank all of you personally for making this broadcast a success, but also all the broadcasts that we've done over the past 3.5 years. I want to thank our wonderful production team for the work they've done and staying with it through thick and thin. So I'll miss all of you, but mes amis, au revoir.